So welcome everyone. My name is David Pyle, and I am the regional lead for the Mid-America region. I think I've met a couple of you. I can see people online, but a lot of people, since I'm new to the region, though not new to this work. I became the regional lead of the Mid-America region in September of 2019. But I've been on congregational life staff serving in both the Central East region and the New England region for the last 7 years. It's a joy to be with you all. This is a class that I usually am used to doing in person. And so we're all growing in our ability to do things online that we normally wouldn't do. Usually I would have flown to be with you all in a setting somewhere to be able to do this class. But I'm grateful that we're getting able to do it as an online program. This is a program that is meant to be 3 sessions, but you can attend any single one of them you want. Now, if you've registered for one, we're going to make sure you get the links to the videos for all of them, but we're not planning on putting these on the on our webinar because we want people to engage in this with us every year. We want people who are new to board members to come and have the chance to ask questions and engage with us, so that it's not just a dry resource that you're engaging with, you know, recording. You're coming to a program. So it's wonderful to be with you. An unscientific poll of everybody who has their video on. How many of y'all raise your hand? Are you newly serving as board members either this year or coming into next year? Quite a few people have their hands up. So that is not the only group that we have that we wish to engage in this webinar, but it is the group of people that's in mind when I crafted it, when I developed this program. We're also going to talk about some other resources for board training and board development for all board members, but we'll get started with board basics. So, first session, what we're going to do today is we're going to talk a little bit about why congregational boards are different than other kinds of boards, than nonprofit boards, than school boards, than academic boards. We're going to talk about what makes congregational boards a little different. We're going to talk about the operational and strategic board continuum, and don't worry about what that means yet. We'll get there. We're going to engage with several different types of governing boards, several different lanes the governing boards form themselves into. We're going to talk about the relationship with the executive and the relationship with the minister. In many congregations, those are the same, but not always, and we'll talk about where those differences are. We're going to talk about how relationships and roles change when you are serving on the board, how your relationships in the congregations and the ways you interact within a congregation may shift and change, and how you keep that clarity in your own mind and heart, and which is role clarity and how to achieve it. We'll talk about the 5 strategic tasks, which we've actually developed into the 7 board practices. And we'll talk a little bit about governance documents and the board as a good employer. That's a heavy agenda for today, right? So we're going to do our best with that, but know that there's a bunch of resources that are coming along with this. Just to give you a hint for the next 2 sessions, and these are already up on midamerica.org, or on uua.org/midamerica if you want to go ahead and register for these 2 sessions. The next one is on July 28th, and it is on technical and adaptive skills for board service. We'll talk about adaptive challenges versus technical problems and how to tell the difference. We'll use the metaphor of the balcony versus the dance floor and what it means to be differentiated as a leader. We'll talk about the meanings of confidentiality and transparency. We'll talk about healthy disclosure, how a board communicates with congregations, especially when times are difficult and hard. And we're going to debut a 4-part process for being able to communicate with congregations. We'll talk about linkage, how you stay in relationship with the stakeholders of the congregation. We'll talk about what board covenants are and speaking with one voice, voting and consensus process, effective meetings, and healthy conflict within boards. And then the 3rd session, which will be August 25th, which is probably the more tools and techniques. It's the more granular session. It's the more how to do it session. One is how to read a congregational budget and a profit loss statement. There's this assumption that so many of us bring that from somewhere else in their life. And I frankly, before I served on my first congregational board, I had no idea what that collection of numbers on a page was. So we'll talk about that. We'll talk about process observation and how to use a consent agenda, board meeting and board workshop styles, powerful questions, cottage meetings and town halls, how to do for the board to do a culture assessment of the congregation's culture, board roles and positions, and open and executive sessions, the difference between them. And that is the center of this in-person board basics course. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you one of the things at the end of the workshop now is that there is also a 12-part board training program on uua.org for congregational board members, meant to be that a board could take a little time every month and go through all 12 sessions together. And you'll get those links at the end of this webinar, and we'll talk about what those 12 sessions look like. So with that, everybody take a deep breath. I'll do one of my old things, just go up here, grab right up here, grab that seat belt, and then bring it down and buckle it in right down there. So we're gonna do quite a bit in the next 90 minutes, well, less than 90 minutes now. So a few reminders for this webinar. Use the chat box to ask questions during the presentation. I am the only person right now that can see those questions when you ask them. The slide deck is designed to be both graphics and notes. The slide deck will be sent out as a PDF after the webinar. When sharing stories or questions, remember your commitments to confidentiality. This is not a confidential space. So what I mean by that is when you're asking a question, be careful. Like, for example, one time I did this webinar, a person came out and said, our board and our minister are not getting along at the UU Fellowship of East Overshoe. Well, that was not information that was out publicly prior to that. So just be cautious and know that I am available, and all the other members of the Mid-America staff are available if you need to be able to have conversations and get consultation that is a bit more sensitive. The webinar is being recorded, and presenters are available outside the webinar. Like I said, all of us on the Mid-America regional staff, the thing we love most about our work is when congregational leaders reach out to us with questions, with challenges to process through something. It's the thing, we do a lot of other stuff, but that's the thing we love doing more than anything else. So there are some assumptions ahead. And I learned a long time ago that I exist like almost all human beings, I think all. We exist, we all have assumptions. So the best thing I can do is to tell you at the beginning of this time we're gonna spend together what my best guess on what my assumptions are. That way you can judge some of the things that I might share or say based upon those assumptions, based upon those core ideas that I hold. So some of the underlying assumptions of this webinar. Number one, the purpose of church is not governance. The purpose of church is not having a board, right? The purpose of church is the congregation's mission. It's what the congregation is meant to accomplish in the world, the change in people's lives and in communities that the congregation exists to serve. Governance is good when it is serving the mission. Governance, I define governance as the systems by which we make decisions together. How we together make decisions with one another. So the process of how we make decisions together is best when it is serving the congregation's mission. The second is that culture is stronger than structure. That you can make all the changes to a congregational culture you want, to a congregational structure you want. You can do board charts and graphics, and this committee is going to report here, and the congregation will still do the things it has always taught itself to do. Because culture is stronger than structure. Unless you work on changing the congregation's culture, the basic assumptions behind the congregation, no structural changes you make is going to shift a congregational system. Next assumption is that the most effective way to make changes in a congregational system is for individuals to change their own function. This is a lesson that comes to us from a little thing called family systems theory, that I cannot make my mother do anything. I learned this a long time ago. I cannot make my mother do anything. What I can do is change how I behave and let my mother react to that. I think that's true of congregations as well. You can't make anyone in a congregation or even a whole congregation do anything. All individuals can do is change their own functioning, and that the congregation will then adapt around those changes. If boards want to make changes in the congregation, boards should act differently. and the congregation will adapt around that as a core assumption. There's no single right way for a congregational governing board to function. I'm one of the UUA's governance consultants, and a lot of governance consultants come into congregations saying, this is the system. If you use this system, it will solve your problems. I am of the belief that there is no single right way for a congregational board to function or for congregations to make decisions together. All of our congregations are unique. They are blends of history and culture and the people that are in them and prior experience, and all of that means that no two congregations are going to do things the same way. And I also believe that there's not such a thing as best practices. For me as a consultant to say, this is the best practice, this is the best way to do something, makes the assumption that all the congregations are the same. And in my experience, they're really not. So I bring ideas that may or may not work in your system, and you won't really know them until you try. I hope that makes sense to everyone as the assumptions that are at the base of this webinar, and really most all the work I do in governance. So, everybody take a deep breath. Now, once again, we're going to do our unscientific of the people that had their video on poll. How many people have served on a board that wasn't a church board, a congregational board? A school board or a nonprofit board or something like that. I worked for a while on a hospice board in Chicago, and those boards work differently. They're different than other, and certainly different than corporate boards. So some of the reasons why congregational boards are different, and I like to do this part in the beginning of Board Basics because people bring in a lot of wonderful experience from previous boards outside of congregations and are often then struck by the way that the congregational board just doesn't function the same way. The first is a different level of policy development. Now let's take a corporate board or even a nonprofit board. When most of the people who work in the mission of the nonprofit, work for the corporation, are paid by the corporation, they need a different level of policy because they can be held accountable in a different way. They can be held, you know, if I need a policy for the Mid-America region that says that I will make sure, and we have one that says this, I will make sure that all of our Mid-America regional staff are paid and compensated with benefits equivalent to the staff that work directly for the UUA. I don't need one that tells me all the ways to make that happen because I'm accountable, because I'm an employee, right? I'm the executive of a nonprofit, which is the Mid-America region, if you didn't know that. When I'm a volunteer in a congregation, I need a deeper level of policy. I need more information about how we do what we do. And so congregational boards produce policy at a much more granular level than corporate boards or nonprofit boards or strategic boards. That's one way it's different. Another is a different form of linkage. When I was with the hospice in Chicago, you know, we would see our staff members once a year at a party. And I never went to go see the patients in the hospice, right? I would interact with donors some, but you know, in a congregation, however, you're all a member of the same church. You teach RE with the people for the institution on whom you serve in their board. You go to coffee with them. You are in Zoom worship with them now, right? You're in covenant groups with them. The relationships are different than they are, and they are much closer. And that can be a challenge. That can be a problem. It can also be a great blessing because that challenge often leads to congregational board role confusion. In this conversation right now about the future of our congregation, am I a board member or am I a religious education teacher? What's my role in this moment? Whereas the member of the board of a corporation doesn't have that same kind of role confusion. It's a different relationship with the executive. You know, when I as the executive for the Mid-America region, but also when I was the district executive for the Joseph Priestley district of the UUA, me and my board president had a very collegial, very hardworking, very close relationship, but I was not his minister. I was not his pastor. And yet in many of our congregations, not all, but in many of our congregations, the person charged with the executive function is also the spiritual leader of the community. And that makes for a different relationship with the person who's charged with managing the operations of the institution, of the congregation, who is being engaged in that mission by the board. So congregational boards are also different in kind from other boards, because board members in our congregations usually have a covenantal relationship as members of the congregation. You are not just members of a board, you're also church members together. You have a commitment to each other for each other's spiritual care. You have a commitment to each other for working to create the congregation's mission in the world that's different than people who may be serving on a school board together. If the minister is a full board member, minister in many cases can be a full board member with or without voting rights. This is the place where I usually say ex officio does not mean not really a board member. Ex officio means board member by right of office. So in most congregations, a minister who is ex officio is a board member. And usually when they don't have the right to vote, which isn't always, sometimes they do, but when they don't, the reason for that is to protect their pastoral relationships. It's so that you never end up on the opposite side of a vote from your minister, and to protect that relationship. There's a higher level of responsibility and accountability to the congregational membership in a congregational board. I mean, if somebody's unhappy with something the board is doing, they can grab you in the Zoom room and coffee hour afterwards, right? They can call you. That was not true for, people in some of the other boards I've served on. They wouldn't even know really who I was sometimes. So it's just a different level of responsibility and accountability. And because board members are fully integrated in the life of the church, and as are their families. I mean, one of the challenging places that some board members report is when a board or a congregation is going through a difficult time, and their spouse or their loved ones who are parts of the congregation are affected by that. And the board member may even know things that they can't really share with their loved ones. And that's a really hard thing to hold. And board members often have multiple other leadership roles. Once again, our unscientific poll of people have the video on, how many people is serving on the board going to be your only role in the congregation? Right? Of course not. I mean, you're at a minimum, you're also members, right? And being a member is a role, right? But most of us, if we're serving on the board, we're also teaching RE, we're working in the building and grounds group, we're in a covenant group. We have lots of, I always love to make coffee. That's probably my control expressing itself, but I always loved that role. So we also have multiple other leadership roles that we have to manage. The other way that governance in congregations is a little different is that we have what I refer to as the 3 levels of congregational governance. Let me run through what these are. Governance level 1 is, who has heard of the term congregational polity? The idea that we are the community of the gathered saints who, that each congregation is its own authority. And that the congregation is inherently responsible to its members through the congregational meeting. So I call governance level 1 the congregation as expressed through the congregational meeting and any institutions that are directly responsible to the congregation through the congregational meeting. Documents at governance level 1 is the bylaws or the constitution or the charter or the incorporation documents. All members of the congregation, however that's defined, have a direct voice and vote at level 1, but it meets very rarely, hopefully, and it's really not a great body for making most decisions, right? But so that's why most congregations, all congregations, create governance level 2, which is the board and any institutions that are directly responsible to the board. Now that could be board standing committees. That could be an ad hoc task force that the board creates. That could be a committee chairs in some congregational systems that are directly responsible to the board. They're created by the congregation's bylaws, and while congregational polity is the operating system at governance level 1, at governance level 2, there are multiple possible operating systems. This is a place where lots of people get confused, because governance level 2, the board is making a decision and somebody thinks that everyone should have a voice in that decision, because they're confusing the operating system for governance level 1 with the operating system for governance level 2. Does that make sense to anyone? This is a little esoteric governance geek speak, but the point being is that at governance level 2, the decision body is the board, not the congregation as a whole. And this is a hard piece for some people to hold. Then we get to governance level 3. Governance level 3 is the actual operations of the congregation. It's how committees make their decisions and who the committees are responsible to. It is how contractors get paid. It is how the worship service gets crafted. It is all those things that we do happen at governance level 3. And in some congregations, especially smaller ones, but not all, the board is the authoritative body at both governance level 2 and governance level 3. The board is an operational board running and managing, and all the committees are responsible for that. In other congregations, the minister might have been set up as the executive, as the chief executive officer, where the minister is that responsible party at governance level 3. Does that make sense to everyone? So you're going to get this, and they're different. While some of the systems, and you may have heard these, some of the systems that are operative at governance level 2, some may have heard of policy governance, some may have heard of governance and ministry, some may have heard of liaison board structures, some may have heard of what I call a dual board structure. So there's different forms for how that process takes. Now, I'm going to skip back and say governance level 1, there are other ways besides congregational polity to function at governance level 1. For example, you could have a bishop, such as our Episcopalian cousins. Or you could have a presbytery, such as our Presbyterian cousins. So governance level 1, it's amazing. A lot of what defines different religious denominations is less theology and more how we make decisions together. Theology comes after that. So we're going to spend a few minutes on governance documents, but before we do that, I am going to open up. We haven't had anything in the chat yet. Is there any clarifying questions? What I mean by clarifying questions is there something that is just confusing? I am going to go and I think I'm going to unmute. I'm going to allow people to unmute themselves if anyone has a clarifying question at this point. All right, nobody is unmuting themselves. So I'm going to move on. Amazingly, I seem to be clearer than I usually am. That may be the clearest I've ever done the 3 levels of governance ever. So let's talk about more level stuff. Let's talk about governance documents. So remember those 3 levels, right? So you've seen these mixing bowls before. Every governance consultant talks about mixing bowls because it's the best metaphor we can find. It's that these mixing bowls sit inside of one another. So we're going to go to your outest mixing bowl of your documentary structure for a congregation are your green bowl, your bylaws and your constitution. These create the outer structure of the institution, of the congregation. And they design the relationship between the board and the congregation as a whole through the congregational meeting. One of the main purposes of a set of bylaws or a constitution is to define the relationship between the board and the rest of the congregational meeting. They can only be altered by a vote of the congregation. And they define the part, and I'll tell you this, in some states, I don't think they're any in Mid-America, but in some states, they cannot even be altered just by a vote of the congregation. They also have to be accepted by the Secretary of State to make changes to your congregational constitution or bylaws. I don't think that happens in any of our Mid-America but I served in the DC area for a while, and it's complicated. Um, and they define the parts of the congregation that are directly accountable to the congregation. Now, what are some examples of parts of a congregation that are directly accountable to the congregational meeting as a whole? Sometimes this is something that congregations choose to do with an endowment or an endowment board. Sometimes it's the nominating committee. In some cases, congregations define every committee as being directly accountable to the congregational meeting. I will tell you that is not something I recommend. Most committees need to be accountable to the board or to however you define the executive. But if there are places where the congregational meeting wants to have a direct accountable relationship, they would do that through bylaws, and realizing that's putting those institutions on a similar par to the board, because the board is directly accountable to the congregational meeting. So the next bowl in for your congregational governance document structure as a board member is the yellow bowl. It's the governing policies. Now these are how the board says the congregation is structured, what the committees are, how the committee chairs are selected, how new people are invited into committees. What is the board's own structures going to be? Does the board have the ability to have online board meetings? That's something all of us are figuring out right now. Is there a way to take a vote through email? What are all the policies about? Because think about this, policy is what we do, who we are and what we do. So whatever the board does and whatever the congregation does, these are often written into governing policies that define the structure and how the board functions. The next one in the blue bowl is what I refer to as the operational policies. Now, these are also promulgated by the board, just like the governing policies are, but they're more what we do of congregational life. A great example that I always use of a governing policy is when I was serving our congregation in Ventura, California. California passed a law about the inclusion of service animals in congregational life. That registered service animals were a public utility, and we agreed with that. But we also had members of our congregation who had animal allergies. So how do we craft a policy that recognizes the need for both of these groups to have access to the congregation? That's a what we do question. And I'll tell you what we ended up doing was making a few changes to our building HVAC system and asking in our policy that people with service animals sit on one side of the sanctuary closest to the HEPA filter, so that the airflow flowed in the direction of the of defining the allergens into a space. Now, that is one example of policy, of operational policies. Congregational rental policies is another regular example. Safety policies is another regular example. You can think of easily fundraising policies are an example. You can think of all of the kinds of policy that your congregation hopefully at least has talked about that defines what we do. Now, I'm going to say this a little later, but why do I focus so much on policies? Because policy is how we capture institutional wisdom in congregations. Policy is how we know what is a good way to do something. Because we Unitarian Universalists, we like to change leaders a lot. And that's a good thing most of the time. But how we capture the wisdom of what is the best way for greeters to make sure that everyone feels included, even those with service animals or animal allergies. How do we capture that wisdom in a way that when greeters change over, that wisdom is not lost? And the way we do that is through policy. The next one, the red bowl, is procedures. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because procedures, except for the board's own procedures, should not really be a board's work. Procedures should be done by the committees themselves and by the staff creating procedures. So the board says what we do, and the staff and committees and other leaders define how we do it. Now, I have met 2 congregations, I think in the last 7 years and over the 300 congregations I've worked with, who actually had formal procedures. I think it would be wonderful if we had formal procedures, and some congregations have a few of them. But realize this is kind of the thing that is out there that we will never fully reach, and it's also not really the board's work. So I'm going to stop there again, and I'm going to seeing if there's any clarifying questions. I don't hear any, so I'm going to move us forward. Did y'all like that one? Did it come through the origami crane? Did that I love that one. So let's talk about congregational boards, because I said earlier, no two congregational boards are the same, because no two UU congregations are the same. That the culture and history of a congregation change. And so really, one of the things I ask new board members to do is to take a look at your own board along a couple of continuums. One of them that I like to use is this operational versus strategic continuum. So let me define them a little bit. An operational board is a board that makes all the decisions that relate to program and money. That almost all decisions within the congregation either come to the board or can be appealed to the board, especially if it's about what the congregation does or relates to significant use of money, even when that money is within the budget. So this is the board of a large number of our smaller congregations, and also some larger ones. That a board really spends almost all their time managing the business of the church, doing the business of the church themselves. I will tell you one example I love is that I went to visit one board, and they invited me to come and observe their board process for a board meeting. And they spent the first, 35 minutes of the board meeting discussing who should get keys. And I asked them, this was not a small congregation, and I asked why they were the ones doing this, why they didn't write a policy and then let the staff decide who gets keys. And the answer they gave back was, well, we're the ones that are going to get in trouble for it if somebody doesn't like the answer. So the pressure on an operational board is really because that theory of congregational governance, of congregational polity that operates at level 1, is pushing itself into level 2. Does that make sense to everyone? So many boards live in that space, and it's not a bad space to be in. Is there Paula asked, is there a suggested list of board policies that are essential? There are some documents on this on UUA.org, and I will make sure that I point you all to that. It's not in the resource list, but there are some that are. However, most of the ones that we recommend as board policies that are essential are ones like a safety policy, a disruptive persons policy, and you can find examples of those and a few others on UUA.org. The next style in the continuum is what I call a managing board. So this is where the board has delegated decisions in certain specific program areas, has said to Religious Education Committee, okay, you're responsible for these kinds of religious education decisions. But any decision that they haven't specifically delegated, they maintain responsibility for. So these boards also spend the majority of their time managing the business of the church. But they have made some steps to delegate some specific areas, such as they delegate worship to the minister and to the Sunday Services Committee. They're still, however, the primary source of appeal, where if somebody doesn't like a decision made by the Religious Education Committee that they've been delegated to make, then they take it to the board. They take their disagreement with that decision to the board. The next style is one of the hybrid boards that I call, is called a portfolio board. And in this kind of board, this is also a small to medium-sized congregational style usually. The board members themselves are the committee chairs. I am not saying I am recommending this program, but the idea is that the board is itself a collection of committee chairs. One of the challenges of this is being committee chairs is pretty busy all on its own. It's a pretty full amount of work to be the RE committee chair or the worship committee chair or the committee on ministry chair. So this is not one of the hybrid boards that I find that works. What it does is it solves the problem of confusion between committees and the board, because the committees are the board. One of the more common versions of a hybrid board, however, is a liaison board. And many of you all may be serving on congregations with liaison board systems. In a liaison board, board members serve as assigned liaisons to committees. So I am the trustee from religious education. I am the trustee from social justice. I am the trustee from worship. These boards tend to have prioritized a level of connection. One of the challenges of these kind of boards, though, is that boards tend to get stuck into a type of resource, infighting is too strong a word, but that you know, when people come to board meetings, they are there with the mindset that they are representing their area, not looking towards the health of the whole of the congregation. The next type of board is the strategic board, and we'll talk about the 5 strategic tasks in a little while, but operational authority lies elsewhere. This is a board that has said, okay, our job is thinking of the future. Our job is setting policy. Our job is looking for how we can better live our mission as a congregation. And this group, be it the minister, or be it an operations team, or be it a staff team, or be it another board, frankly, often called a program council, they're responsible for running the church. Some other group is responsible for all of the operations and management of the congregation, so that we, the governing board, are going to focus on policy generation, on good assessment, on strategic planning, on developing our mission. And there's another level of this kind of strategic board, which is based in a system that comes to us initially from corporate America, but translated through the nonprofit world. And this is a policy governance board. I am not going to do a class in policy governance. Policy governance really clearly defines the relationship between the board and between whatever the executive is. If you're in a congregation with a policy governance board and you'd like some help thinking through how to understand that system, I would love to receive an email from you, and we could pick an hour of time to talk. Some of the versions of policy governance you may have heard. John Carver's policy governance. Another one that's real popular in the Mid-America region is the consulting that has been done with Unity Consulting out of Minneapolis, out of St. Paul. And then there's also a wonderful book by a dear friend of mine named Dan Hotchkiss, named Governance and Ministry, which is another version. It's not really policy governance, but it is a translation of policy governance into congregational life. Can people begin to envision where your congregational board might be in this continuum, where you all might rest? But understand that it's a continuum, because congregational boards develop along it. So somebody sent me their email and their phone. I'm not going to remember that. Send me an email at dpile@uua.org, and I will respond to that email. Thank you. I'm also not going to read your email and phone number online on a recorded webinar, I promise. So, and can you have a policy governance board without a minister? That's a very interesting question, Paula. What I will say is this: as long as you have defined an executive, that the board can be in that accountability relationship with an executive, then you can. There are some congregations where the minister is not the executive, where, say, an executive director is. And you know, that as one example of what you're naming. In those congregations, the minister serves fully as a member of the board. So here's a wonderful the relationship with the executive, between the board and however you define the executive. I love this cartoon. And for those that can't read it, I'd like to ask the council's advice on how to get the congregation to sit closer to the front of the church. Because the relationship between the board and however you define the executive is the key relationship for a board. Now, in some congregations, the board is also the executive. And so in that case, usually the challenge is defining when the board is functioning in a strategic way and when the board is functioning in a managing executive way. Because you can guess what happens. Almost all of the board's time gets taken up in that managing executive role. And the board ends up having very little time to do good strategic planning, to do good assessing of the congregation's programs, to do good discernment about the mission of the congregation and what it calls the congregation to. Because all of those operational things seem so much more immediate. Now, in many congregations, the executive is the senior staff member or the senior clergy leader. And this brings in a particular challenge that our congregations face that many other boards don't, and that being that our senior clergy leaders are also our spiritual leaders. And congregational boards, it's a transition that the minister also has to take a lot of responsibility for managing well, but I like to highlight it to new board members, just to know that this is a space where you have an accountability relationship with the person who is your pastor, your minister. And that can be a hard place to hold. So there is no one answer to who fills the executive function in your congregations. We talked about this. The board may be both. The minister could be the executive. There may be a lay professional team as the executive. There's all kinds of others. A longtime elder member may informally be the executive. I served a congregation as a church administrator, not as a minister, where no decision of the board was really real until Mary ratified it when somebody called her after the board meeting. And if Mary didn't like it, then the board would reconsider the decision, right? Because Mary was really the elder of the congregation. And I dearly love Mary. I mentioned that program counselor or an operational second board might serve as the executive. But being intentional about the relationship between the board and the executive is a key part of the board's function. And the more formal the executive, the greater the accountability. So the more the board defines what the executive is, rather than just letting it be Mary. Mary was completely unaccountable. Luckily, Mary was deeply loved and had the best interests of the church at heart. But the more formal that person is in the executive relationship with the board, the greater the accountability that the board has. So I'm going to show you this as a graphic. We're not going to spend a ton of time on it. I'll tell you where it comes from. This is one formulation of the relationship between the board and the minister that is coming from Dan Hotchkiss's Governance and Ministry. You may have seen this. It's sometimes called the Twin Peaks. But what it basically shows is that the board and the clergy are in a accountable relationship through policies, and that they have overlap areas in between them where both of them have authority. And that overlap area is a place where the board and the ministry, the board and whoever is the executive, need to manage those relationships and authority. I will say the difference between policy governance and governance and ministry that is depicted here is that policy governance imagines a complete split between the governance oversight and the operational authority of the executive, that there's a hard line between them. And in reality, in my experience, most congregations are too complicated to make that split work. Not all. There are some congregations that can do that split well, especially some larger ones. But say this again, please, I will do that. So in Carver style and even Unity Consulting style policy governance, there is an expectation that the board will stay in the board's governance lane, and that the minister or executive will stay in the ministry operational executive lane, and that there's not overlap between those two lanes. Most congregations struggle to make that not have an overlap, to make there not be places where the board's interests and the ministry's interests are, if not conflicting, they're both looking at the same issue, the same concern. Say a capital campaign. A capital campaign has elements that are connected to the ministry and operations of the congregation, but it also has governance implications about how we make decisions together. And so dividing those up so that the lanes are clear is really hard for some people to hold. I'm going to stop here because we're getting deep into policy governance, and I'm willing to do one-on-one consultations with people to deeper understand policy governance and policy governance systems. So thank you. So if your congregation has a minister, and not all do, I talked about this a little bit earlier, it can be complicated because it's a different relationship between ministers and congregations based upon the congregation's bylaws and the nature of the ministry. Some bylaws make the ministry an ex officio member. Some are voting and some are not. Others don't. In one congregation I served, I was not ex officio, but I supported the board as a staff member. Some bylaws define a clear separation between the board and the minister. Others don't. This is one of the places where really it is unique into the congregation's history and culture what the relationship is between the senior clergy leader and the board. Minister, when ex officio, the minister is both a board member and clergy, and it sometimes matters if the minister is called or contract. I'm going to assume that most people get the difference, but a called minister is there on an indefinite tenure by a vote of the congregation. They're essentially elected as the minister by a vote of the congregation, the same way the board is elected. A contract minister is hired by the board for a defined period of time, often for a defined role. That's not the full ministry of the congregation. In many cases, most members don't experience a difference between called or contract, but it can make a difference in the relationship between the board and the minister. When I've served as a contract minister for congregations, I worked for the board. If I had been called, and I never was, because I was always an interim or developmental minister, but if I'd been called, I worked for the congregation through the congregational meeting at level 1. Does that make, and I'm partnered with the board. You see the difference of how it can change your relationship? So many boards, because of this complexity, covenant with their minister, have a specific letter of agreement, have a board covenant that defines the roles and expectations and responsibilities of this relationship. So relationships and roles change with your board service. I will never forget being with a board member in a congregation in Delaware where they came to me and they said, you know, I was really popular in this congregation before I joined the board, and now everyone's mad at me all the time. And I don't know that I really want to, now I hope that didn't scare anyone off, but you know, the reality is the board becomes a focal point in some ways. And we have to think through how we shift that. To a congregant, you may be just thinking, well, this Sunday I'm just a religious education teacher, and I'm going to be in the religious education classroom. Hopefully we'll be back in the classroom with our class as soon as we can when we have safely navigated this pandemic. But let's say it's a virtual Zoom room. And before the RE classroom, one of the other teachers comes to you talking about how unhappy they are that they have that there's potentially going to be a cut in the DRE's salary due to some budget issues. They're really unhappy about this. Now you're there as a religious education teacher. Your relationship with this person is built as a religious education teacher. But are they talking to another religious education teacher in that moment? Most times, no, they're talking to a member of the board. And knowing how to manage this role shift, to be able to listen to the members of the congregation with both your congregant lens, with your friend lens, with the relationships you all have, but also as an elected spiritual leader of your congregation responsible for the congregation's vitality and mission. I name this because it is a shift that a lot of board members struggle with. And I'd love you to begin thinking about it now. That doesn't mean you're not still a religious education teacher. It just means that at any time, you also need to be aware that at all times, you could also be a board member. So people will see you through the lens of congregational leadership as well as membership. fellow congregation members may have expectations of you that you are not aware of. And they, especially when they feel that you're committed to something in the same way they are. An example of this is a member of the congregation, not the one I serve, but one I worked with, that had been very committed to OWL our whole lives, our youth and adult sexual education program. And when they became a board member, this was a thing that was being considered for whether or not the congregation could continue to fund it in the same way. And when they voted to not continue to fund it in the same way, it felt really challenging for those members of the congregation that they'd been OWL teachers with. Even though as a board member, they'd seen the larger perspective. They knew what the dynamics that the congregation was facing. And that was a very hard thing for them and for their fellow OWL teachers to process. The other congregants will just begin to view you sometimes through whatever lens they already view the governing board. Unitarian Universalism, I don't think I'm being radical in saying, we tend to attract people who have some authority, who have some issues with authority, right? That comes into our faith tradition in lots of ways. And in some ways I celebrate that, but realize some people may be processing those challenges they've had with authority in other parts of their life within the safe space of the congregation. And the term that this is used for is projection, is that they may be projecting that issue that they've had, those challenges they've had with people in a position of authority in the past. And so I just want you to be aware that that's not about you personally. That's about how people interact with their religious community. And that you, as an elected board member, are now a religious leader in your congregation and in your community. It's not a secular role to be elected to the board of your congregation. Many people think of, the minister of the congregation as the religious leader, and there is truth to that. But in our history, under congregational polity, our congregations elect their own religious leaders. Serving as a board member, you are serving as a religious leader of Unitarian Universalism in your town, in your community. And that your UUA regional staff now has a more formal relationship to you. That means me and my colleagues, Lisa Presley and Sharon Dittmar and Phil Lund and Cameron Young and Nancy Combs Morgan and Andrew Zoller and the other members of our admin staff. As the UUA staff, we are in direct relationship with our congregational boards and with our congregational religious professionals, religious educators, ministers, music directors, membership directors. Those are our primary relationships. I will engage members of a congregation, but that's not my primary relationship with you. It's with you. It's with the elected leaders. And that's a shift some people take a little while to grasp. So I'm going to move through this one a little fast. You'll get this in the notes, but it's just some guidance, some ideas for how you can attain the role clarity. And I'm sure you're already thinking of some of those possibilities. But realize that maintaining this role clarity, knowing when you're a board member, and realizing you could always end up being a board member, is what most board members report is the most difficult part of being a congregational board member. Staying awake in meetings is easy. Reading through the agenda is not terrible. And I promise the budgets are not that bad when you get used to them. And profits and loss statements can make sense, right? But managing the relationship shifts in the congregation that can happen, especially during times of strife, crisis, and stress, can be one of the most challenging parts of serving on a congregational board. And if you are having those challenges, other board members are great resources, your religious clergy are great resources, your other religious professionals are great resources, and you can also reach out to your regional staff. Because we journey through this with congregations and leaders all the time. So this is a different workshop that I'm going to run through really quickly. And the reason why I'm running through this really quickly is because I want to give you an idea of what a strategic board does. We get what all the managing boards do all the time, right? Deciding on which contract is going to come, negotiating between committees that each think they're both responsible for something, deciding who gets keys, right? But I wanted to give you a vision of what a strategic board, what is in their responsibility. So the first of those 7 responsibilities is to discern the vision and mission of the congregation. Now, discernment is one of those words that I went to seminary and paid $70,000 so I could use in the webinars like this. But what it really means is thinking deeply about the mission and the vision of the congregation. I define the vision of the congregation as who do we want to be and what do we want the world to be. And the mission is what parts of creating that vision are we best equipped to create right now? Do we have the resources, the talent, the energy, and the experience to do right now? So the mission is how do you create the world you want to live into? The vision is the world we want to live into. Now, congregations come up with mission statements and vision statements, and those are wonderful. I have led so many workshops with congregations, helping them to craft a vision and mission statement. And when they're really good, the congregation lives with them. They breathe with them. They read it all the time. They ask questions about it. But it's often really hard to do that unless a group is taking responsibility for doing that on an ongoing basis, both amongst themselves and in the wider congregation. And that is what the work of the congregational board. I say when a board is doing this really well, the board feels like a covenant group on the future and the mission and the vision of the congregation. And boards that have deep conversations, and they'll be in the 3rd session, we'll do some techniques about how to do this well. Boards that have those deep conversations, they learn about each other. And that makes all the other decision-making easier. When you've been able to have deep conversations about what is the vision and mission of the congregation, then making a decision about a policy involving renters is easier because you know what's important to you and to your congregation because you've done those conversations. You know what the values are. You know what the hopes are. Hope that makes sense. So again, I'm flying through this. This is an hour-long workshop. I'm going to do in 10 minutes. Fiduciary responsibility. This is what most people think of when they think of the governing board. And when I say the word fiduciary, people immediately think of money, think of finances. And that's true. Managing the congregation's finances to fully live the mission. Because the congregation's finances are meant to equip the mission. They're not actually meant to be saved, although having good reserves for a time such as this is always a good thing. But the resources of the congregation, however, are bigger than money. Making sure we're not burning out our leaders and our volunteers is a fiduciary responsibility. Making sure that the vision of the congregation is known in the community is a fiduciary responsibility. Making sure that the congregation's name, that how the community thinks of the congregation is what you want it to be, is positive, productive, and leads towards the mission, that's a fiduciary responsibility. Making sure the congregation has appropriate insurance. I want to say that again. Making sure the congregation has appropriate insurance is a fiduciary responsibility. Making sure the buildings are taken care of is a fiduciary responsibility, all for the purpose of leading, allowing the congregation to be resourced and equipped to fulfill the mission to create the world we want to create. So we talked about earlier policy generation as a primary work of a strategic board, because policy is how we capture the institutional wisdom. Now, policy generation, there are a few people like me that get excited about policy, but I know most of us tend to go to sleep. Here's a great thing. The board does not have to write all the policy. The board can find other people to write drafts of the policy that the board then discerns through and approves. Right? There is nothing that says the board members have to stay up till late at night trying to write the policy. And in fact, board members usually don't have all the necessary information to come up with a good policy. I do make the recommendation that you have a single format for policy in your congregation and that you encourage people to use that format, and when they're approved, they're all put in that format. But good policy comes from both within and beyond the congregations. As I said, there's a lot of really good policy examples on UUA.org, both in finance, in employee policies, personnel policies, in and I won't go through all of them. And safe congregations, there are so many, and I think there is an article on what in Leader Lab, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, on what a good policy base for a congregation looks like. And some governance systems, such as Dan Hotchkiss's Governance and Ministry version 2, have a policy example book at the end of that book. And if anybody is trying to do governance and ministry and you would like that policy example that's at the end of that book in electronic format, email me. I can't post it anywhere, but Dan gave me a copy that I can share with congregations. You just have to hold up and show me that you have at least one copy of the book. So policies, the key is to keep them all in the same place and in the same format and review them regularly. Assessment. So knowing where you want to go, congregational boards have to assess where you've been. And this is one of the things of a work of a congregational board that doesn't happen as often as maybe it should. And that's the board taking the time to look at what is the health and vitality of the congregation. And when I teach congregational boards to start thinking about how to do this, I usually say, pick 2 areas of the congregation this year that you, the board, want to learn more about. Let's say you want to learn more about the potential for campus ministry. Or you want to learn more about whether or not your building, what it would take for your building to be healthy and vital and in good condition for the next 25 years. Just pick 2 areas. Maybe it's how well your committee on ministry is functioning. And then develop some questions and think about who you need to talk to be able to learn more about those things. How well is religious education going this year? What about our new curriculum that the RE program debuted 2 years ago? How well is it doing? How do the teachers engage with it? The board seeking to learn this knowledge is the board's practice of assessment. Now it can get very formal, and such as there's a wonderful tool for both assessing the health and vitality of a congregation and of a ministry called Fulfilling the Call, which is both an evaluation tool for ministry and it is also a health and vitality tool for congregations that was created by the UU Ministers Association. And you can find it at uuma.org, but also at the UU bookstore. And I highly recommend congregations. It's a wonderful tool that's available to you. And if you download it, you can get it for free. If you buy it, it's like 15 or 20 bucks. But the next one is, we used to call this strategic planning, but I call it planning for the future. Because it doesn't have to be completely formal. It has to be the board doing some conversations and possibly producing some systems to where the board is making planning. Now, we used to tell everybody to do 5-year strategic plans. And we found that a lot of congregations would put a lot of effort into creating that 5-year strategic plan, and then it would go on the shelf, and 4 years later, somebody would find it and read it to see what they should feel guilty about for not having accomplished. I've learned for me that 5 years is a little too long. That most congregations can plan well on about a 3-year time scale. And so what I recommend is a congregation do what I call a 3-year rolling plan, where every year you got a 3-year plan and every year you're assessing the year that just passed and adding a new year. There'll probably be another workshop on rolling strategic plans in the fall, a webinar. But this is a time period that shows that planning. There's a wonderful quote by President Eisenhower when he was General Eisenhower. Plans are useless. Planning is essential. Because it's in planning that you learn the things about yourself and about your congregation that you need to know to be able to adapt when things shift, when things change. So congregations that have done good planning, we're actually seeing have been a little faster to adapt to this pandemic because they've done good work about what was important to them and already ready to think through how they could reach those same goals in a different circumstance, in a different dynamic. There's also long-range planning, and the one place that I usually push for long-range planning is in your building, is planning for the future of your property. So the next of the work of a strategic board is the relationship building and maintaining. because the board is the primary body representing the congregation other than the staff. And a congregational board, this means the relationships within the congregation, both having linkages and conversations and abilities for people to talk to the board, and for going out and reaching out to people individually as board members and taking them for coffee and listening. But it's also relationships within the community, with other religious institutions in the community, with other community groups. Think of anyone invested in the success of the congregation and its mission, and that is someone that the board is responsible for building and maintaining a relationship with. Now, that does not mean the board is doing it themselves. It means the board is responsible for making sure that those relationships are being built and maintained. Your social justice committee may be doing a large portion of that building and maintaining a relationship, but they're in an accountability relationship with the executive and the board in doing it. It's also building relationship with your UUA, with your association, and with the other UU congregations that are within the greater area of you. One of the great hopes I have for this time of virtual time together is all of our congregations are figuring out how to make Zoom work. Well, that works to talk to the UUA, but it can also work to talk to the UU congregation 20, 30, 50, 60, 100 miles from you. I know of two congregations that have made a practice of the two boards twice a year get together on Zoom and just talk across these two congregations. And they find all kinds of great ways that they can be in relationship and partnering with one another. The last is transformation. And this one I'm just going to name here because this takes some coaching and going deeply. But because the board is doing this discernment, because the board is aware of the resources that are available, because the board is discerning the mission and vision, because the board is assessing the health and vitality of the congregation and looking to some future planning, the board is the place where there is some of the best opportunity to see the ways that the congregation could change, the ways that the congregation could transform, the ways that the congregation could transcend its own culture, and then can work to change its own functioning to help that change happen. I think of a congregation where almost every communication in the congregation was really about scarcity. It was really about, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough staff, we can't live into the things that we want to accomplish because we don't have enough. And the board said, did some discernment around this and said, okay, we want to change this cultural dynamic. What can we do that would begin to work against this culture of scarcity? And they partnered with the minister, and the board and the minister did a worship service where they had raised some money separate from the budget to be able to give 5 members of the congregation $500 each, with the only thing saying, do it to make the world better. Do something to make the world better with this $500. And those people went out and they did things to make the world better with those $500, and they came back in another worship service and they talked about it. But one of the things they found was that a whole bunch of other people have been inspired to take their $500 and go do something to make the world better too. And all of a sudden they were beginning to push against this narrative about scarcity, about we don't have enough to do the things in the world we want to do. That's what I mean by a board that's working to transform, that is able to see the whole system, to be able to say, where could we do something different that would make us better at living our mission and vision? And then serving as an agent of change to be able to do that. Now that's a lot. And I don't expect all boards to do all of this all the time or to be as good at doing all of this all the time. It takes work to build up the muscle memory to hold all of these things. And usually at this point in a workshop, somebody has raised their hand and said, I just agreed to say yes to come to a meeting once every month. And I get it. Amen. I hear it. So realize your congregation is already a miracle. The fact that our congregations continue to exist in this society, in this world, when everything, there used to be a time where serving on the congregational board was one of the greatest honors you could be asked, and where nothing else but church happened on Sunday mornings. It's not the world we live in anymore. So the fact that our congregations still exist is already a miracle, is already wonderful. What I'm hoping to do is to point towards what could be some of the ways in which your congregation could strive along these lines to develop a little further. Your board could strive along these lines to develop a little further. And that's why in the first session I set this tone. Through the next 2 sessions and through the end of this one, we're going to be really practical. And the move into the really practical is one of the places where I want our congregations to be better. I'm not saying that all of you are not wonderful employers. I am saying that a lot of our congregations are not. And it's very possible that none of them would come to this webinar. So, but there's places where, because we have a lot of decisions that are made by lay leaders, because accountability works differently, being a good employer is something congregations have to work at. And I will tell you, I have served in 3 different roles in congregations on church staffs of all different sizes. Church is the hardest place, and I've been in the Army for 18 years, both as a chaplain and as a combat soldier prior to that. I've deployed 7 times in my life. Working in a church is probably harder than almost anything else I've ever done in my life. Because in church, there's not clear lines of authority in most of our congregations. It's all relational. It's not me at a desk working on a spreadsheet. It's me in people's lives, which I love, which is why I do what I do, and it's hard. It's messy. And it's being able to remain self-differentiated when somebody comes to the board and says, I think we're paying our staff too much. And you're saying to yourself as a staff member, this is not about me, this is not about me, this is not about me, right? Church is an emotionally hard place to work. It's also an emotionally beautiful place to work. I love the work that I get to do for a living. When I was in parish ministry, when I was a church administrator, and now as regional staff. Because church is where it matters. And I'm using church, that's my language. You may be in a fellowship or a congregation or a society. But the religious community is where things really matter. And the great thing for our staff and our congregations is that why do they serve our congregations? Is it because we pay amazingly well? Rarely. Is it because the benefits are amazing? Sometimes. It's because they care about our mission and vision. They care about who we are and what we're trying to accomplish in the world. And yet they are also not members. In most cases. There are some cases where staff may be members, but in most cases, they're not members. So they're at one remove from the overall life of the congregation. So being a good employer is a goal that I wish that every board would set for itself. So things to know as an employer. Every congregation should have an employee and a volunteer handbook. These are procedures. Says to employees what the basic policies are around the treatment of employees, outlines a grievance procedure, and volunteer handbooks spell out what the expectations are of volunteers. Because in many of our congregations, volunteers are, in essence, unpaid staff. They are doing work that in any institution that was not a congregation, a paid person would be doing that. In the hospice that I worked for and then served on the board of, paid people did those things. We had volunteers. They came and sat with our hospice patients. But a lot of people have, the more detail you can give to people, the more procedures and policies that you can spell out, the better it is, the better you're supporting them. Every employee should have an up-to-date job description that forms the basis of evaluation and supervision. I'll tell you how many times I asked for a person's job description and it's 10 years old. And with the question, can this realistically be done in the hours that the person is supposed to work? Because church staff, because they care about the vision and mission of the congregation, they often overwork. I know that I would at times as a minister, and I'm not complaining because I love what I do, but as a minister in a congregation, there were times I'd work 70, 80 hours a week. And most of that can't be seen by the whole of the congregation because it's in confidential counseling. It's in working with the board. It's in researching and writing sermons. So is it something that is viable for that staff person to do? And here's one of my, and this is in smaller congregations, this is harder to do, but I really do believe that people should be supervised by an individual and not a committee. Being supervised by a committee means that you have no clarity about who you're responsible for and what your accountability is. So there's lots more on how to be a good employer. Evaluation should happen yearly. Employees should be fairly compensated. There's lots of resources on UUA.org that can help you to determine fair compensation for every church staff position. State laws can vary. Workers' compensation may be required and may not. And employment of ministers has special rules. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but all of the things you might ever want to know about employing staff in a Unitarian Universalist congregation can be found at the UU Office of Church Staff Finance. We have an entire office at the UUA that is focused on doing three things. They are focused on providing resources to you to help you be good employers, managing the benefits program that the UUA offers to our congregations, and managing a few grant funds to be able to support staff members that are in need in certain circumstances, ministers and others that are in need in certain circumstances. And you'll have this entire PowerPoint with the link that you see before you. And you'll see some of the things that are there. A couple of resources I want to name before we go. You have survived. You have survived this time so far. Now, this is 1/3 of the full webinar, the full thing. I got it. But I want you to give yourself an applause, right? Because you all have survived so far, right? So now, if this is not enough for you, if you need more board training, you do not have to. You do not have to wait until July when we do our next session, because on UUA.org there is an entire 12-part series on how to prepare and serve as a board member. Some of the topics, there are 12 topics, and they all can be engaged in about 30 minutes each of the topics. And there are videos, and there are readings, and there's diagrams, and there's all kinds of stuff. My wonderful colleague, the Reverend Renee Rahutsky, and colleagues Jennifer Kwan and Kathy McGowan did a great job. Reverend Jennifer Kwan and Kathy McGowan did a great job developing this board training program. So governance basics, kind of a version of what we just did today, is the first module. Why we in the room where it happens, why we have meetings, finding your center, spiritual grounding as leaders, knowing your purpose, leading in alignment with your mission. That's a lot of that mission vision stuff that we talked about earlier. The myth of rationality, understanding human nature. Because really, as a congregational board member, you're engaging people. Change in congregations in the wilderness, good boundaries, balancing transparency and confidentiality, which we're going to spend some time on. But I'll tell you, that lesson is wonderful. From me to we and healthy communications, we're also going to spend some time on, but that's also a very good one. We just talked about the board as employer. There's a whole module on that. Guarding the institution, balancing stability and vision, a strategic partnership, governance and ministry, and staying in my lane, governance roles and responsibilities. You can see we hit a lot of the highlights from those, but all of that is in that 12-part series that is available to you at no cost in LeaderLab. Now, has anyone ever heard of LeaderLab on this call? I'm going to tell you what LeaderLab is. The UUA, the Congregational Life staff and other parts of the UUA have been for decades creating resources that lived on the computer of whoever created it. And you had to know who had it to be able to get to it. So we put together a team. I named them earlier, Jennifer Kwan, Renee Rahutsky, and Kathy McGowan, along with some others, who culled and curated all of those resources that have been created by UUA staff for congregations over decades, and produced new ones to replace some of the ones that were more dated, to produce a searchable index on UUA.org called LeaderLab. And you can go to it at uua.org/leadership, and it has a searchable index for anything you might want to learn more about involving your congregation and being a congregational board. From stewardship to board governance, I've got several articles up there on I've got one article for small congregations on how small your board can be. And there's lots of others, but just it's a good resource for you to engage. So a few other resources. If you've not heard of the book Governance and Ministry by Dan Hotchkiss, it's a very good read to understand dynamics of congregational governance. If you're in a congregation doing policy governance, the core work of that is Boards That Make a Difference by John Carver. Healthy Disclosure, Solving Communications Quandaries in Congregations is a must-have, I think, for every board who might face having to talk to their congregation about something difficult, about something challenging. High Impact Church Boards is a great book. The Effective Church Board is another one. I put up here the Mid-America Webinar Library, which is a library of all the webinars that your Mid-America staff has done over the last few years. We're currently culling it a little bit, and then we named Leader Lab. There's also something called the UU Leadership Institute, uuinstitute.org, that is a flipped classroom where you basically, it's a seminary for lay leaders. It's an online leadership school. And you can sign up for classes and take them in semesters, and if you know, and they do credit and all kinds of other stuff. It's wonderful. And they're really low cost. They're about $30 a class. Now, I wish that my seminary had allowed me to take classes for $30 a class. It would have been a whole different experience. And then the last one I'm just going to name is your Mid-America primary contact and your Mid-America staff. Now, does anyone know who their Mid-America primary contact is for their congregation? Don't worry, I'm going to solve that for you. So right here we have, you know, look at where your state is, and this is who on the staff serves as your primary contact. Now, what a primary contact means is we're the people. Your primary contact is your first call, but the reality is you can call anyone on the Mid-America staff you want to at any time. So I might be your primary contact, but you've got a long relationship with Lisa Presley, and you just think Lisa Presley is going to get this more than I will. Call Lisa. Lisa's going to, we have a system whereby any of us talks to you, all of us can see the notes from that. So I will know that you talk to Lisa, and that's perfectly wonderful. And sometimes I'll even recommend you talk to Lisa or Sharon or Phil rather than me, because they're a better skilled person in that area than I am. So with that, we have a couple minutes left. I am going to take us off screen share, and I am going to allow, and you are already, everyone is at where you can unmute. So does anyone have any reflections or questions or anything they want to ask? You all are on a screen over here, so I know I'm looking this way, but I can see you over here. So feel free to unmute if you have a question or something you want to reflect. Please go ahead, Paula.
I was fortunate enough to be at the Mid-America Assembly and attended your workshop. It was terrific.
Well, thank you.
The 7 practices for board leadership, and one of my colleagues from my fellowship up in Door County, Wisconsin, was at the same meeting, and we said, oh, wouldn't it have been neat if we could have sat next to each other and said, oh, we need to do that. Oh, we want to do that, you know,
right.
Because there were so many neat ideas. And I just wondered when you anticipate being able to offer that as a webinar, if that's in the plans or.
Thank you. So it is in the plans, and we are actually going to record it. I didn't record the one at the Mid-America Regional Assembly, because I thought that there was still a recording of it up from a GA a couple years ago, and then we found out afterwards there wasn't.
Yeah.
That they'd taken that recording down. So we are going to re-record it either as a webinar, but we're also looking at, I may record it as a content only for Leader Lab, so that there won't be people, that'll just be me doing it to screen. And then if we do that, what we'll do is we'll invite a time where people can come together to talk about it afterwards, right? That everybody can go watch the video. And so we're negotiating with Leader Lab about that, about whether what's the right format. Do it as a webinar like this, or do it in a way that is, and I also have faith that at some point we will be able to gather together again, and I will probably take that one on the road some to be able to do. So thank you. But you all got a Cliff Notes version of it today.
Right,
and,
right.
Yeah.
I think that the challenge is that for boards who are operating more policy oriented or functionally oriented, the biggest question for us is how do we even begin
Right.
to shift into that direction?
So for that question, I can help boards. I do some one-on-one coaching to be able to help address that. And I've not done it in a virtual format, but that may be something that we can look at doing. So,
Okay.
and I think I'm your primary contact.
You are.
I am.
Yes.
So there we go. So we got about another minute or two. I'm also going to say we're going to stop recording at 8:30 or 9:30 for those who are on the Eastern time zone. I will also stay around for one-on-one questions for a little while afterwards after we stop recording, if anybody wants to do that. But if there's not any questions, I'm going to say thank you all. Have a wonderful evening. It was great to have you all here. And I will be sending out the PowerPoint will probably go out to everybody tomorrow. And I look forward to seeing you all at a later webinar and someday when we can be in person together again as fellow Unitarian Universalists. Have a beautiful week.
Thank you so much.